Hey everybody. Hello, hello. Let me take these off. How y'all doing? I should put these back on so I can have some music, but I won't. I won't do it. Good morning. Hi. Hello. Feel free to type in the chat. Just getting started. All right, so I am here. I need an audience this morning. This morning I was in tears. But you know what? It's all good. I took my robe off, put on some lipstick, so I'm feeling better now. All right, so I'm going to be reading a book by Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventure in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Are y'all familiar with this book here? So right now I'm just reading the introduction. And so with the introduction, I came across many words that I'm unfamiliar with. So I'm kind of having trouble. So I figure if I have an audience, then maybe I could commit myself to this reading and I can get through the introduction. So that's why you all are supposed to be here. But it looks like I lost my viewers. Hopefully someone else gets on here. So I lost everybody, but that's okay. I'm going to keep going. Hopefully someone will jump on and watch me go live. Okay. Oh, no audience today. Oh, there's one person. Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining. I'm getting ready to read the introduction to Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, and Through the Looking Glass. So I'm just reading the introduction. I've already gotten started, and I'm just picking up where I left off. So I'm having trouble reading, so I need an audience. It's just nice to know I'm not by myself. That's all. If you have the book, you can get it. You can get the book. See, I'm on 1, counting 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So I'm on page 10. So if you want to grab your book, you can do that. I'm on page 10. The second paragraph. So it starts in his diary for 1855, which he calls the most eventful year of his life. Dodgson notes that he had begun it as a poor bachelor student and ended it as a master and tutor in CH with an income of more than 300 euros a year and the course of mathematical tuition marked out by God's providence for at least some years to come. In fact, Providence ordained that Dodgson would be a mathematics lecturer for 25 years and persist in the even tenure of his way at Christ Church until his death in 1898, nearly half a century later. His subsequent career as a bachelor clergyman and successful children's writer, living at the heart of the academic and social establishment as the Christ Church Don, was, like his childhood, an impeccably conventional one in almost all respects, but it had one deep-rooted anomaly at its heart, a dream of childhood focused on the figure of a beautiful young girl. It was in 1853, in his third year at Oxford, and after the death of his mother, that Dodgson wrote Solitude, in which he invoked an infant sobbing itself asleep upon a mother's breast, recalling the golden hours of life's young spring, before declaring he would give everything to be once more a little child. For one bright summer day, this anomalous cult of the child was to bring him fame through the Alice books and a certain social catch-it through his camera. But in its Alice books and a certain social catch-it through his camera. But in its wake, it also woke shadowy rumors of scandal as a result of his increasingly obsessive fascination with girls before puberty and his growing preoccupation with photographing them in a scantily clad a state at possible in bathing drawers, for example, or preferably in the nude. A girl of about 12 is my ideal beautiful or beauty of form, he wrote in 1893, and one hardly sees why the lovely forms of girls should ever be covered up. The anomaly's first name and incarnation was Alice Liddell, and it was in the shadow of Alice's name and the pseudonym of Lewis Carroll, author of the Alice books, that Dodgson lived his later life. The Liddell children first entered the young mathematics tutor life in 1856, the year after their father, Henry Liddell, previously head of Westminster School, co-author of the famous Greek lexicon, and a high-profile reformer, was, to the conservative Dodgson's alarm, appointed dean of Christ Church. It was Harry Liddell he met first, the handsomest boy I ever saw. The handsomest boy I ever saw. Then Lorena. In April, however, the 24-year-old Dodgson, then very much a novice at what was called the black art of photography, tried to photograph the new dean's three small daughters, including the 3-year-old Alice, in the deanery gardens. It wasn't a success aesthetically, though they wouldn't keep still. But this first of innumerable attempts to photograph Alice and her sisters established him at the deanery. The three girls in the garden, most of them, and we became excellent friends, he wrote in his diary. In June, he took the 10-year-old Harry Liddell rowing with him on the river, and soon afterwards, the unchaperoned 7-year-old Lorena on another river trip. He noted that day in his diary with a white stone, and he marked all special days. During the next few years, there were many such days as Dodgson, despite his political differences with the dean on many college issues, became a regular intimate of the dean's family, taking pictures, playing cards, and croquet, telling jokes and stories, and messing about on the river. While he was by most accounts a rather dreary college tutor for undergraduates, he seemed to have been in his element with the deanery children, who clearly put him in touch with his familiar role as family entertainer under the rectory umbrella at Croft. During these years, his intimacy with Alice grew as the series of hunting, yet subliminally creeping photographs of her and her sister show. As Michael Bakewell says, these pictures tell us, if nothing else, he was in love with Alice. But they don't tell the whole story, and there is a frustrating gap in the written records Just at this crucial point, Dodgson began keeping a diary in his third year in Oxford and went on doing so until his death. The 13 volumes of these were available to his first biographer, but the two volumes that cover the years from April 1858 to May 1862, during which Dodgson's intimacy with Alice was maturing, have disappeared, either lost, as the family subsequently maintained, or more likely destroyed. Furthermore, though they fortunately resumed just in time to record the weeks leading up to the genesis of Wonderland and the famous river expedition that June, the diaries are interpreted once again for the 3 days in late June 1863, when Dodgson's intimacy with Alice and the other Liddells was abruptly terminated forever by her mother, the formidably social, ambitious Lorena Liddell. Mrs. Liddell also destroyed all his letters to Alice. It is one of the great ironies of Dodgson's life that by the time Wonderland was published in 1865, making her about the most infamous 7-year-old girl in history, and him the most famous children's writer, their relationship was a thing of the past, and Dodgson was banned from the deanery. We don't know why the kissing had to stop or what brought to an end the stories, photos, and river expeditions, expeditions, which provide the frame for Wonderland. But stop they did. When he saw the Liddell children again the following December, the diary record, I held myself aloof from them, as I have done all this term. There were family rumors that Dodgson proposed to Alice, but was rejected, either because she was too young or that he in his 30s was too old, and that this obscure young mathematician don't match Miss Liddell's notoriously snobbish expectations for her daughters. She like hobby-nobbing with royalty and is probably parodied in the references of Kingfisher and Dodgson's skit on the Dean's architecture taste. The vision of the three T's, romance with teenagers, like stuttering, was evidently something to which the Dodgson boys were prone, for at about the same time Dodgson was head over heels in love with Alice. His younger brother Whitfield fell in love with another teenage Alice, the 14-year-old Alice Duncan. Unlike Charles, however, Wilfred went on, after a decent interval, to marry her. In 1862, Charles had photographed her prophetically as a teenage bride in a bizarro composed photo and ellipment. In a diary entry in 1866, Dodgson described a conversation about Wilfred and A.L., presumably Alice Liddell, as a very anxious subject. It was such an anxious subject for everyone concerned that none of the interest parties ever discussed it again in public. Recalling her memories of Wonderland 70 years later, Alice Hargreaves, as she then was, steers well away from any mention of her on the celebrated author's feelings, and through Dodgson spoke later of Alice as his ideal child friend. He never explained the nature of their friendship or the dramatic rift that separated them. By the time he published Through the Looking Glass in 1872, he was writing as if she was dead. Its opening verse, child of the pure, unclouded brow, speak of Alice and the author being half a life asunder, while the closing poem, A Boat Beneath a Sunny Sky, reads like an elegy for Alice, though it was written when she was still in her teens. In fact, the coda to her adventures through the mirror is almost hearty K in its wintry word of lyric attuations. Long has paled that sunny sky, echoes fade and memories die. Autumn frosts have slain July, still she haunts me photom wise. Alice moving under skies, never seen by walking eyes. Alice has become a figure in his dream. The nature of Dachshund's love of Alice remains a subject of speculation on the evidence of his surviving letters and diaries. Dachshund, though a most self-conscious writer, was not a man with a very intense self-consciousness or interest in his own motives or feelings. Dachshund, the photographer, had a horror of being photographed himself. Similarly, while his diaries and letters diligently record his daily visits, meetings, and journeys, including his rendezvous, 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 rendezvous with children, they tell us remarkably little about his feelings, in complete contrast to the diaries of the younger contemporary Gilbert, with their vivid insight into that other bachelor cleric voyeuristic interest in young girls. In his diaries, Dachshund regularly commemorates his meetings with Alice and the other Liddells during their years of close contact. He was obviously half in love with the whole family by making the days of his diary by white stone an usual code for a day of exceptional pleasure. After the boating expedition in 1856 with Harry and Edna Liddell, for example, he wrote, "Mark this day, analysts, not only with a white stone, but also altogether dies mirabilis." Another entry for 26 June 1857 goes, "Spent the day at the deanery photographing with very slender success. Though I am disappointed in missing this last opportunity of getting good pictures of the party, it was notwithstanding one of the pleasantest day I have ever spent there. I had Alice and Edith with me till 12, then Harry and Enna till the early dinner at 2, which I joined, and all 4 children all afternoon. The photographing was accordingly plentiful, interspersed with swinging, backgammon, etc. I marked this day most especially with a white stone." So backgammon, etc. I mark this day most especially with a white stone. This is as close as the diary ever comes to telling us what the children meant to him, but it conceals as much as it reveals. The analyst is no analyst. The cryptically jubilant sign post of the white stone is also a burial stone, a symbol of what his contemporary Matthew Arnold called the buried life. When we look for evidence of Carroll's inner life, what kinds of experiments might lie buried behind the rigidly externalized record of the diaries and letters, the pamphlets and memoirs? This is what meets us, a white stone. The number of serious poems dating from these years and published later in The Three Sunsets, 1898, suggested preoccupation with sexual guilt contrasted with visions of childlike innocence. The Valley of a Shadow of Death, Beatrice Stolen Waters, Only a Woman's Hair. They may tell us something of Dachshund's mystery. Pedophile sexuality. The watery guilt scenario played out in Stolen Waters of 1862. For example, though largely stolen from Coleridge and Keats' exercises in the Gothic bald form, invokes a happy innocent child, apparently 5-year-old, and this sainted ethereal maid is threatened by a grim wild beast, a savage heart in human guise. During the same period, Dachshund's diaries are particularly wrecked with conventionally poised expressions of guilt and resolutions to change his life. At his best, recent biographer Morton N. Cohen notes such entries occur overwhelmingly in the decade 1862 to 1872. His great creative decade most intensively in the years from 1862 to 1867, culminating in 1863. The year of the break with Liddell's and the time of the genius of the Alice books. Sometimes later, his friend Lord Salisbury wrote, "They say Dachshund has gone out of his mind in consequence of having been refused by the real Alice." Liddell adding that it certainly looks like it. Dachshund himself, while noting the fact of the banishment from the Liddells, says nothing of this or anything else about his state of mind at the great watershed in his life represented by the publication of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1866 and the break with its only begetter, Alice Liddell, tells a telling moment in Through the Looking Glass, which bears on Dachshund's resistance to autobiography. The horror of that moment, the king cries after Alice and put the little royal chess piece down. "I shall never, never forget," advised the queen, to make a note of this in his memorandum book. He starts to do so, only to have Alice force his hand and write, "The white knight is sliding down the poker." He balances very badly. Reading it, the queen exclaims, "That not a memorandum of your feelings." The same hold true not only of Dachshund's diaries, but Corellian nonsense. They hold both horror and desire at bay. In fact, nonsense can convert the disorderly world of unbalanced feelings into externalized absurdity. Much of the obsessional inventiveness of Dachshund's life, in particular his imaginative life, his investment of inventing games, puzzles, ingenious gadgets like his nictograph, and night writing, his list of catalogs, can be seen as a defensive construction against not only anxiety, but his own subjectivity and its potential for disorder. In the preface to the revealing entitled Pillow Problems, 1893, Part 2 of the less revealing entitled Curiosa Mathematica, he recommended his mathematical puzzle exercise as a way of diverting people's mind from troubling through and disturbing feelings. There are skeptical thoughts which seem for a moment to uproot the foremost faith. There are blasphemous thoughts which dart unbidden into the most reservant souls. There are unholy thoughts which torture their hearts, hateful presence, the fancy that would fain be pure. Against all some real mental works is a most helpful ally. This tells us something about his thoughts as well as his thoughts about how to divert and disperse them by mental works. His taste for mathematical problems, such as those in A Tangled Tale, for new word games such as doublets and sieges, for logical puzzles such as are described in the game of logic, obviously provided him with harmless obsessional activity which deflected him from the dangerous world of subjective feelings. This must have been one of the attractions of nonsense too, which its systematic, playful derangements of sense, its experiments in disorder from within an unshaking framework of orderliness. Yet in the nonsense of the Alice books is nowhere else Dachshund found a license to explore not only his identifications with his child heroine, Heron, but his distorting skeptical admission of his own intelligence, which most of his life he had to hold at bay. Dachshund, by only all account, was profoundly preoccupied by balance, orderliness, and control. As Isa Bauman noted, all the minutiae of life received an extreme attention at his hand, and his hands always wrote a pair of great cotton gloves. There were two sides to this. It made him a stickler for detailed principle, rules, and regulations when it came to running the college, which led to regular altercations with the dean, college servants, and fellow don when he was creator of the common room. Except to little girls, he was not an alluring personage, wrote William Tuckwell of New College. Tuckwell characterized him as astray, shy, precise, absorbed in mathematical reverie, watchfully tenacious of his dignity, stiffly conservative in political, theological, social theory. He His life mapped out in squares like Alice's landscape, yet to girls he clearly was a alluring personage, as many of them testified later, and his room of Tom Quad appeared to Isa Bauman as a fairy land for children. If so, it was fairyland which, like the squares in Alice's landscape, was precisely mapped out, as though the looking as through the looking glass the game of logic and his popularizing works of logic all show. Dachshund remain a Euclidean even at play. At the heart of Alice books is Dachshund's dream identification, which his child Harion. The writer sees through Alice's eyes. In his later work, he never attained this kind of identification again. In his other literary and pictorial representation of children, they remain very much objects of adult manipulation. They are viewed through the sentimentalist or the voyeur's lens, and idealized fictional innocence like a protagonist of Sylvie and Bruno, or as a carefully staged beauty's captured clothes, particularly clothed or unclothed, in the huge archive of his photographs of child models. The newly invented camera of Dachshund's passport to respectable middle class and artistic homes, allowing him to gratify his passion for capturing the famous social, literary, and artistic lions of the day on the one hand, Tennyson and Rossetti's Milius, George MacDonald, Ellen Terry, Prince Leopold, and other Oxonian, George MacDonald, Oxonian, and national celebrities, and little girls on the other. The girls might be dressed as themselves, or in theatrical costume, or in what came to be his favorite costume, wearing nothing at all. Alice Liddell was his passport to Wonderland, and Alice in Wonderland became his passport to fame. A fame that, for all his notorious touches about his incognito, he would return letters addressed to Lewis Carroll, was central to his relationship to the host of Little Girls who succeeded Alice. Writing to her in 1885, he wrote his mental picture of his ideal child friend was as vivid as ever. He had scores of child friends since her time, he said, but they have been quite a different thing. Dachshund's family was the exception of his unlikely trip to Moscow in 1867 was lived at the heart of upper middle class England, anchored to Christ Church, Oxford. From this base he kept an eye on his many unmarried stuttering siblings who went to settle in Guildford after their father's death and took long seaside holidays, first on the Isles of Wight, then at the more respectable Eastbourne, where they could indulge his passion for over other people's young daughters. During the rest of the year, he took regular trips to London to photograph the famous visit family and friends, and pursued the main cultural interests by visiting theaters and galleries. As with photography, however, his cultural interests to revolve almost exclusively around little girls. He enjoyed their company and regularly took them to plays and pantomimes, art galleries, and exhibits where was particularly interested in viewing other girls on stage or in picture frame. His taste in theater was largely determined by his taste for child actresses like Ellen Terry and by the real or imagined taste of his child friend. He disapproved of music hall and in Podsnappish Vine told Marian Richards, I have a dream of the bowl bowderizing bowl bowder that is editing and a Shakespeare that shall be absolutely fit for girls. He disapproved of the Isa Bauman when she played morally questionable roles and was a ceaseless campaigner to keep the theatre free of any remote sexual innuendo or whiffed or irreverence. Much of the same can be said of the visual arts. Though he was a keen admirer of the pre-Raphaelites, the view on art recorded in his diaries are largely confined to remarks about the beauty or otherwise of children represented there. It was fortunate for him in this respect that Victorian painted catered so generously for his particular taste, that he had been born in the heyday of Cubism and or abstract expressionism, he would not have fared so well. Year by year, his diaries scrupulously recorded not only these visits to studios, galleries, and theaters, but the list of child conquests made on trains, beaches, and in other places of public amusement. Dodgson was the Casanova of the Victoria nursery. In 1863, he listed in his diary the names of 108 children, all girls, that were photographed or to be photographed, arranging from alphabetically arranging them alphabetically. There were 5 Alices, 5 Patrices, 6 Constances, and so on. His diaries, year by year, are a roll call of conquests. Eastbourne, 1877, was a particularly good year for cruising at the seaside. I could, if I'd like, make friends with a new set of nice children every day, he wrote in August. And when he set off for Guildford in late September, he listed 34 children's names in his diary, all female. He was writing Illucid and his modern rivals at the time. In 1879, he told the 12-year-old Kathleen S. Wedge, one of the many girls he met on trains, I am fond of children, except boys, and we have more child friends than I could possibly count on my fingers, even if I were a centipede. By the way, have they fingers? I am afraid they've only feet, but of course they use them for the same purpose, and that is why no other insect except centipede ever succeeded in doing long multiplication. Dodgson's particular variation on long multiplication was little girls earned him Jean Cocteau's title and in Pawnee Don Juan des Neves Amores, with the exception of his analogous pursuit of this endless sequence of little girls. He led a thoroughly conventional, industrious, and parochial life as a don in Oxford, and after his father's death in 1868, as head of the largely unmarried Dodgson family, he had 6 unmarried sisters, now housed at Guildford. In addition to his children's books and comic verse, he published over 200 books and pamphlets, as Warren Weaver calculated. These included over 60 popularizing works of mathematics and logic, from Euclid and his modern rivals, 1879, to symbolic logic, 1896. 30 or so devoted to games and puzzles and Concat Castle, Croquet Castle, devised for the Liddells in 1863, to lawn tennis tournaments, the true way of assigning prizes, 1883, and his own game of logic, 1886. A further 50 taking part in quarrels and contention at Christ Church, mostly revolving around disputes with the two reformers, Jowetts and Liddells, the most important of these being collected in notes by an Oxford Chiel in 1874, and a further 50 or so on miscellaneous public subjects ranging from proportional representations and to vivisectionism, some popular fallacies about vivisection, 1875, to stage the spirit of reverence, 1888. One of the perennial bees and his clerical bonnet and belated pamphlet, Resident Woman Student, 1896, finally endorsing the principle of higher education for women not at Oxford itself, but in a separate woman-only university. Many of these from Mariel works cast some light on the mindset which gave the world the Alice stories and are important for that reason. But it is doubtful that they would be read today were it not for the enduring appeal of the Alice books and the hunting of the snark. Dodgson's great period was from 1862 to 1876 when he published his dark, parodic nonsense epic, The Hunting of the Snark. Had he died in his mid-40s, one of his biographers reminds us, posterity would have lost much of C. L. Dodgson's and little Lewis Carroll. Even the ultimately mischievous Sylvie and Bruno was originally conceived between the two Alice stories. Dodgson resigned his mathematics lectureship in 1881, but stayed on as a senior student of his college, preferring to give occasional lectures on logic at girls' schools. Then teach undergraduates. After retirement, he published his most ambitious book on logic, Symbolic Logic, in 1896, his one collection of serious poems, Three Sunsets, 1893, and his most ambitious children's book, The Two Parts of Sylvie and Bruno, in 1889 and 1893. There were intended, he said, to combine the innocent merriment of childhood with thoughts not wholly out of harmony with the greater cadences of life. Though Sylvie and Bruno has its place in the Danish tradition of romance-oriented children's writing that leads to George MacDonald to C.S. Lewis, is largely unreadable and unread, despite its dizzying experiments with time and interlocking narrative. The intrusive adult viewpoint of the narrative and the increasingly dyadic preoccupation of the narrator prevent the huge contraption contraption taking off. At its close, not Sylvie's, but an angel's voice was whispering, "It is love!" Here, as throughout his last 4 years, the graver cadence have taken over. Dodgson became increasingly reclusive, lonely, and moralistic, and though he liked to dumb himself, the aged man, after the character in the song from Through the Looking Glass, his work rate never slacked, nor despite his increasingly moralizing public persona did his taste for the company of young girls, as can be seen in the characteristic letter of 1892. For my old age, I have begun to set Mrs. Grundy entirely at defiance, and to have girl friends to brighten, one at a time, my lonely life by the sea, of all ages from 10 to 24. Friends asked in astonishment, "Did you hear any other elderly clergymen having young lady guests in this way?" And I am obliged to confess I never did, but really I don't see why they shouldn't. It is, I think, one of the great advantages of being an old man that one can do many pleasant things which are quite properly forbidden to a younger man. In fact, he had been setting Mrs. Grundy a defiance for years, and even as much younger man doing just these things which he suggests are properly forbidden. He had given up nude photography in 1880, soon after Mr. and Mrs. Owen began to condemn this, to him, innocent pastime, Once more, the pages of the diary that record this crisis have been torn out. In 1885, however, undeterred, he took up sketching young girls in the nude in the studio, and to commission pictures of them from the artist's friend Gertrude Thomas. Many of his late letters concern these interests in nude children, and in a letter to his sister Mary of 1893, he had to define himself against a good deal of utter misrepresentation about all this. Rumors had continued to circulate. In another letter of 1893, he calls himself a sentimental old fogey. But quite how all this related to the Christian's vision of love in his sermons and at the close of Sylvie and Bruno, and an open question. Nowadays, no doubt, the police of the social service would have become involved, but in general, the families of his child friends appeared to raise no objections. He died in January 1898 in Guildford, working to the end on the proofs of the three sunsets and the second part of the symbolic logic. After a small scale family funeral, he was buried in the modest tomb in the churchyard there. However, we understand it. Dodson's intense fascination with young girls is a prismatic anomaly, at least the heart of his life, and his two unparalleled masterpieces, the Alice books. Though he never matched their art or popularity again, they transformed his life, and the rest of it was lived in their shadow. Dodson continued to take an obsessional interest in their fate until he died. He not only went on revising the layout and punctuation of the twin Alice books until 1897, when he produced his final correction text, but he also published the MS Facsimile of Alice Adventures Underground in 1886. Marketing the cheaper People's Edition in 1887 to reach a wider audience, producing the embarrassing, awful, shorter Nursery Alice for younger children in 1890, kept an eye on translations into European languages, fostered stage adaptations, coached actresses who played Alice in the theater, wrote Alice on the stage for the theater in 1887, and recalled in a series of commercial spin-offs like Alice Biscuit Tins and Umbrellas. Part of the reason for this was no doubt commercial. Dodson was a shrewd businessman. Part of it was aesthetic. He loved to supervise and control every stage of the production of his works and make them as near perfect as possible. More than this, however, I would guess that such activity linked him to his most creative moment, his literary birth as an author, his ever multiplying audience of children, and the story's first listener and heroine, Alice Liddell. The Genius of Alice. The story of the compassion of Carol's Alice adventure in Wonderland is almost as known as the book. Indeed, it forms part of the story itself. If the character of the author has an intimate bearing on the book, so does the character of its first listener, its setting, and its heroine. Most of the protagonists have left accounts of the origin and development of Alice's adventure, but the most prominent of them is condensed in the opening poem of the book itself. The verse prelude or frame poem anchors the text in the golden afternoons when the first improvised when he first improvised it for three children in a boat on a river. Thus grew the tale of Wonderland. Thus, slowly, one by one, and quaint events were hammered out, and now the tale is done. and home we steer a merry crew beneath the setting sun. On this model, the whole tale, though growing slowly, was hammered out on the golden afternoon and was finished by the journey home that evening. When they came to record their collections of dachshunds after his death, two of the three passengers on the boat confirmed this miraculous tale of the tale. Canon Duckworth told his first biographer. I was very closely associated with him in the production and publications of Alice in Wonderland. I rowed stroke and he rowed bow in the famous long vacation voyage to Godstow. When the three Laddells were our passengers, and the story was composed and spoken over my shoulder for the benefit of Alice Liddell, who was acting cox of our gig. I remember turning round and saying, Dachshund, is this an extempore romance of yours? And he replied, Yes, I'm inventing it as we go along. I also well remember how, when we had conducted the three children back in the deanery, Alice said, as she bade us good night, oh, Mr. Dachshund, I wish you would write out Alice's adventure for me. He said he should try, and he afterwards told me that he sat up nearly the whole night committing to a MS book his recollection of the Dolleries with which he had enlivened the afternoon. He added illustrations of his own and presented the volume, which used often to be seen on the drawing room table of the deanery. According to Duckworth's miraculously condensed account, Dachshund narrated the story one afternoon, wrote it all up that evening at the sitting, and presented it to Deanery soon after. Alice herself left two accounts confirming the golden afternoon story, but also modifying it. She told Dachshund's first biographer, I believe the beginning of Alice was told one summer afternoon when the sun was so burning that we had landed in the meadows down the river, deserting the boat to take refuge in the only bit of shade to be found, which was under a new made hayrick. Here from all three came the old petition of tell us a story, and so began the ever delightful tale. Sometimes to tease us, and perhaps being really tired, Mr. Dachshund would stop suddenly and say, and that's all till next time. Ah, but it is next time, would be the exclamation from all three. And after some persuasion, the story would start afresh. Another day, perhaps, the story would begin in the boat, and Mr. Dachshund, in the middle of the telling, a thrilling adventure would pretend to go fast asleep to our great dismay. She elaborated on this in an article written with her son in the Cornhill during the centenary year of Dachshund's birth. Nearly all of Alice's adventures under the ground was told on that blazing summer afternoon, with the heat shimmering over the meadows where the party landed and sheltered for a while in the shadow cast by the haycocks near Godstow. I think the stories he told us that afternoon must have been better than usual, because I have searched a distinct recollection of the expedition, and also on the next day I started to pester him to write down the story for me, which I had never done before. It was due to my going on and importantly that after saying he would think about it, he eventually gave the hesitation promise which started him writing it down at all. This is referred to in a letter written in 1883 in which he writes of me as one without whose infant personage I might possibly never have written at all. She acknowledges, however, that both the poem and the Canon telescope, the time of composition more than a little. The result was that for several years, when he went away on vacation, he took the little black book about with him, writing the manuscript in his own peculiar script and drawing the illustrations. Finally, the book was finished and given to me. But in the meantime, friends who had seen and heard bits of it was at work on it, were so thrilled that they persuaded him to publish it. Alice Liddell, Alice Hargreaves, by then, looking back nearly 70 years later, extends the timescale of writing, but also of oral composition on her account. The Golden Afternoon was only one of the series. As it is, I think many of my earlier adventures must be irretrievably lost in posterity because Mr. Dodgson told us many stories before the famous trip up the river to Godstow. No doubt, he added, some of the earlier adventures to make up the difference between Alice in Wonderland and Alice's Adventure Underground, which later was nearly all told on that one afternoon. Much of Through the Looking Glass is made up of them too, particularly the ones to do with chessmen, which are dated by the period when we were excitedly learning chess. Though we are bound to be a little skeptical about Canon Ducksworth turning his walk on part into a starring role, there can be no question about Alice's role as heroine, audience, and patron. Nevertheless, like most of the other accounts, Alice's plays up her participation on the second book to stories improvised for herself and her sisters. In Alice on the Stage, written in 1887, over 20 years after the event, Dodgson gives his own fullest account of the story. Many a day had we rowed together on a quiet stream, the three little maids and I, and many a fairy tale had been extemporized for their benefit. Whether it were at times when the narrator was I, the vain and fancies unsought come crowding thick upon him, and at times when the jaded muse was goaded into action and plodded meekly on, more because she had to say something than that she had something to say. Yet none of these many tales got written down. They lived and died like summer midges, even in its own golden afternoon, until there came a day when, as it chanced, one of my little listeners petitioned that the tale might be written out for her. That was many a year ago, but I distinctly remember now, as I write, how in a desperate attempt to strike out some new line of fairy lore, I had sent my heroine straight down the rabbit hole to begin with, without the least idea what was to happen afterwards. And so, to please a child I loved, I don't remember any motive. I printed in manuscript and illustrated with my crude design that rebelled against every law of autonomy or art, for I never had a lesson drawing. The book, which I have just had published in Fast Smile, in writing it out, I added many fresh ideas which seemed to grow of themselves upon original stock, and many more added themselves when years afterwards I wrote it all over again for publication. But this may interest some readers of Alice to know every such idea and nearly every word of the dialogue came of itself. What is striking about Dachshund's account and his instance on the automatism of it all, a founding state of disassociation comparable to psychoanalytical or surrealist free association. The story and the idea came of themselves, he insists, without his conscious intervention or control. Through Dachshund reinforces the myth of the golden afternoon of its origin. He identifies two other stages in its composition. Firstly, the manuscript stage, completed for Alice soon afterwards, and secondly, years afterwards, the stage of writing up for publication. In all three stages, however, the narrative material is self generating. If we turn from these public and retrospective accounts of the genius of Alice's adventures to the evidence of Dachshund's diaries and letters of the time, we get a more detailed sense of its progress from improvised open-air children's story to published book. An 1862 diary entry for the day in question sets the scene but curiously doesn't mention storytelling at all. July 4th, Atkinson brought over to my room some friends of his and Mrs. and Miss Peters, of whom I took photographs and who afterwards looked over my album and stayed to lunch. They then went off to the museum, and Duckworth and I made an expedition up the river to Godstow with the three Liddells. We had tea on the bank there and did not reach Christchurch again till 8:15. When we took them on to my rooms to see my collection of micro photographs and restored them to the deanery just before 9. It was only the following February he annotated this on the opposite page, on which occasion I told them the fairy tale of Alice's adventure underground, which I undertook the right out of Alice, and which is now finished as to text. Through the pictures are not yet nearly done. Though the pictures are not yet nearly done. On this evidence, the first written text of adventures was completed 6 months after the day the oral story was pulled spontaneously out of Dachshund's hat like a white rabbit, with which it begins. Dachshund's diaries record other incidents from before and after the golden afternoon, which find their way into the final text, which as the visits of Nunham on June 17th, where Duckworth, Dachshund, and the three girls got drenched. This surfaces in the Pool of Tears episode, in which Duckworth and Dachshund features as the duck and Dodo, and everyone gets soaked, and the game of croquet and the deanery on 3rd July, which must have contributed to the Queen's croquet party in Wonderland. The story continued to evolve and grow after 4th July. On 1st August, he mentioned going to hear the children sing the song beautiful star, which is the source of the soapy parody, turtle soup. On 6th August, a month after the Golden Afternoon, on another river trip to Godstow, he records, he had to go on with my interminable fairy tale of Alice's adventures. It was not until 13th November, in fact, that he records the strictly literary genius of the tale the day after an embarrassingly frosty encounter with Mrs. Liddell. He had been out of her good graces since the husband up showdown in June. Began writing the fairy tale for Alice, which I told them in July 4th, going to Godstow. I hope to finish it by Christmas. In the diary, as in other accounts, Dachshund made it clear the story was written for Alice, but there were other influences. In May, he expressed his pleasure in Christina Rossetti's Goblins Markets, and on 9 July, he recorded a meeting with George MacDonald on his way to a publisher with the MS of his fairy tale, The Light Princesses, in which he showed me some equistic drawing by Hughes. These contemporary precedents must have encouraged Dachshund to think in terms of working up his own story for publication. If Alice eventually prompted himself to think of writing it for months after the Golden Afternoon, the diaries after a much less telescope account of the shift from oral tale to writing than either Duckworth or Alice. They also suggest Dachshund was right for his suggestion. According to the diaries, he finished the MS of Alice's Adventures underground on 10 February 1863 and his illustrations for it on 13th September of the following year. He finally sent the books of Alice herself in November 1864. However, by this stage, Dachshund was no longer thinking of the manuscript version as the end of Alice's adventure. By then, he had fallen out with Mrs. Liddell and was in very strange profession relations with the dean. In fact, after 25th June 1863, he was to see very little of Alice or her sisters, and when he encountered her in Christchurch Quadrangle in May 1865, he noted Alice seems changed a great deal and hardly for the better, probably going through the unusual awkward stage of transition. This was clearly a personal difficult period for Dachshund too, as his dearest child friend began to undergo the awkward changes associated with puberty. He himself began to undergo their awkward effects upon himself, and the aftermath of the break with the Liddells. By the end of MS was completed, Alice was already a figure from his past. Everyone had moved on a long way from the Golden Afternoon. In October 1863, he met the future publisher of Alice, Alexander Macmillan, to arrange some of Blake's Songs of Innocence to be printed for him. Soon in December 1863, he was writing to Tom Taylor for an introduction of Tenniel. Do you know Mr. Tenniel enough to be able to say whether he could understand such a thing as drawing a dozen wood cuts to illustrate a child's book? And if so, could you put me into communication with him? The reason for which I ask are that I have written such a tale for a young friend and illustrated it in pen and ink It has been read and liked by so many children and have been so often asked to publish it that I have decided on doing so. Gravel MacDonald remembered his father, George MacDonald, being one of those dachshunds consulted and remembers himself aged 6, exclaiming there ought to be 60,000 volumes of it. It was our enthusiasm, he wrote, that persuaded our Uncle Dachshund to present the English speaking world with one of the future's classics. Dachshund was confident enough by late 1863 to pursue publication at his own expense and to apply to one of the foremost cartoonists of the day to illustrate it, as illustrations had played an integral part of his conception of the book from the start. Even in the MS, the story begins with Alice asking, where is the use of a book without pictures or conversations? And as he had no confidence in his own draftsmanship, he needed a pictorial collaborator. Tom Taylor, having cleared the way, Dachshund met Tyndall in January and heard from him on 5th April 1864 that he consented to draw the pictures for Alice's adventures underground. The stage was set for a classic double act, though there were subsequently been numerous brilliant illustrations of the Alice books, including Rackham, Peake, Dalai, and Stedman. None have dislodged Tyndall's foursquare Victorian embodiment of Carol's dream text. Dachshund sent Tyndall the first slip for Alice's adventure in May 1864, and one reason for the close bond between text and image is the tight control he exerted over the production of the book. Throughout the next year, there was a close, often tense collaboration between writer and illustrator until the appearance in June 1865 of 2,000 copies of the finished book printed by Clarendon Press for publication by Macmillan and Company. A special presentation copy was sent to Alice Liddell on 4th July, exactly 3 years after the legendary boat trip to Gatow. Soon afterwards, however, Tyndall expressed himself entirely dissatisfied with the printing of the pictures, and Dachshund decided to scrap it, ordering a total reprint and sending off the unbound sheets of D. Appleton and Company, New York, who issued the book in America in 1866. If he was dismayed about the cancellation of the first edition and what it cost him to withdraw it from circulation, he was more than satisfied by the second, dated 1866 but actually published in November 1865. This second edition he found very far superior to the old and in fact a perfect piece of artistic printing. It is an ironic token of Dachshund's perfectionism that what was effectively the first edition of his classic was in fact the second edition. Reviews were not long in coming, and though mixed, were mainly highly favorable. The reader on 18th November described it as a glorious artistic treasure, an antidote to a fit of the blues, and thought it sure to be run after as one of the most popular of the class. On 16 December, the Fayum, however, wrote it off as a stiff, overwrought story, and the Illustrated Times as too extravagantly absurd to produce more diversions than disappointment and irritation. It was not long, however, before the public were won over the Dachshund's book, and Macmillan undertook the first of many republications during the author's lifetime. By 1867, Dachshund was engaged in arrangement for French and German translations, and by the early August 1866, he was telling his publishers he had a flowing idea of writing a sort of sequel to Alice. Alice had well and truly entered the public dominion, but in a sense, her adventures there had only just begun. Through the Looking Glass does not advertise its own origins in the same way as the first book. The prefatory poem harks back to the tale to the tale begun in other days. That is the moment Alice's adventure was conceived rather than the new book. By representing the relationship with Alice so firmly in the past, it hints at the break of Liddell's, as well as establishing a new wintry tone to the story. In February 1867, 6 months after first mooting the idea, Dodgson wrote to the Macmillan saying he was hoping before long to complete another book about Alice. In Alice on the Stage, Carroll claimed that both Alice books were made up of bits and scrap single ideas that came of themselves. Nevertheless, the essay confirms that the plot of Wonderland came to him on the trip to Godstow, and became the magnet which attracts the bits and scraps he subsequently added. Through the Looking Glass had no such single narrative genius. It twain structural ideas of the chess game and mere journey appeared to have come from different sources, reminiscing from the distance of 1932. Alice Liddell claimed the second book, like the enlarged Wonderland, was made up of many, many stories he had told before the famous trip up the river to Godstow, particularly the ones to do with chessmen, which are dated by the period when we were excitedly learning chess. In the same year, 1932, Dodgson's cousin Alice Raikes, also a child friend from the 1860s, provided a rival account. She claimed it was she who had provided the inspiration of the idea of the mirror. While visiting his family in Onslow Square, where she lived in Dodgson apparently called her over, saying, "You are another Alice. I'm fond of Alice's. Would you like to come and see something which is rather puzzling?" She then followed him into his house and into his room full of furniture, with a tall mirror standing across one corner. "Now," he said, giving me an orange, "first tell me which hand you have got that in." "The right," I said. "Now," he said, "go and stand before the glass and tell me which hand the girl you see there has got the orange in." After some perplexed consternation, I said, "The left hand." "Exactly," he said. "And how do you explain that?" I couldn't explain it, but seeing that same solution was expected, I ventured, "If I was on the other side of the glass, wouldn't the orange still be in my right hand?" "I can't remember." I can remember his laugh. "Well done, little Alice," he said. "The best answer I've had yet." I heard no more then, but after years was told that he said that this had given him his first idea for Alice Through the Looking Glass, a copy of which, together with each of the other books, he regularly sent me. There is no record in his diary of Carrel meeting Alice Rikes before June 1871, by when the text was completed. As reported, his remarks that hers was the best answer he'd heard yet suggests the mirror game was a stand trick of Dodgson, and he never credited her directly with being his inspiration, even in her inscribed copy of the book. Incidentally, another correspondent to the Times in February the same year claimed she had furnished Carroll with the idea that Red Queen turning into the Black Kitten at the close. The three rival accounts of the child friend contribution to the Looking Glass are now all part of the legend that had grown up around the composition of Alice, though they have all come to acquire gospel status In the Carolinian literature, it is worth bearing in mind that all date from the year of the Carol century, over 15 years after the publication, and need to be treated with a grain of salt, which is certain is that Alice Liddell, if not the online begetter of the stories, remained their heroine as inspiration. Though no longer in communication with her person, Dodson made arrangements to send her a presentation copy of Through the Looking Glass, with an oval looking glass let into the cover. Behind the figure in the mirror of Tenniel's Alice, or in front of it, in this case, stands the face of Alice Liddell. The letters and diaries of the time tells us nothing about the details of composition, only glimpses of the timetable between conception and completion. By January 1868, after working on the Ripon, he is asking Macmillan whether he can print a page or two of the new volume in reverse, which suggests that both Jabberwocky and the idea of the looking glass are settled. In his diary for 8 April, he referred to the looking glass house, and on 1st November, he confirms that he has finally signed up his reluctant illustrator. The second volume of Alice will after be illustrated by Tenniel, who has reluctantly consented as his hands are full. I have tried Noel Patton and Proctor in vain. By December the same year, he is able to inform Macmillan that he will have a lot of MS ready to set up and proof for the new volume, and he tells a child correspondent that he hopes Tenniel will have pictures done by the following Christmas. In fact, 3 more years were to pass before Tenniel, whose hands were indeed full. He completed the pictures and the book was ready for publication. In January 1869, he refers to it as Behind the Looking Glass of what Alice found there. And it was not until March 1870 that Macmillan confirms the final title, endorsing Through as just the word. On 4th January 1871, he noted in his diary that he had finished the MS of Through the Looking Glass, and on 13th January, the nothing remains to be printed but the verse at the end, adding that the volume has cost me, I think, more trouble than the first, and ought to be equal to it in every way. In April, he records it lingers on through the text is ready. The first copy of the finished book arrived on 6th December, and on 8th December, he was finally able to send copies to the deanery and to await its reception in the wider world. The success was instantaneous. There were over 7,000 advance orders by the end of January 1872. It had sold 15,000 copies. Henry Kingsley wrote that it is the finest thing we had since Martin Chuzzlewit, and when he compared it to the earlier book, called its more excellent song than the other. The Examiner found the sequel hardly as good as the original, but praised it wit and humor, and found it quite good enough to delight every sensible reader of any age. The Illustrated London News of 16th December described it as quite as rich in humorous whims of fancy, quite as laughable in the queer incidents, as lovable for its pleasant spirit and graceful manner as the wondrous tale of Alice's former adventure underground. And Through the Looking Glass never won quite the same popularity as the earlier book, and never attained quite the same place in most readers' hearts, it is nonetheless one of the most successful sequels in literary history. The Haunting of the Shark followed soon after. Thereafter, Carroll, through though he continued to write for another 25 years, he was never to produce anything of comparable inventiveness or resonance. What he found in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass during the 1860s, he was never to find again. For Alice's identity, who in the world am I? That's the great puzzle. In the opening chapter of Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, we are told Alice is fond of pretending to be two people, but early in her shape-changing adventure, she fears there's hardly enough of me left to make one comfortable person. Wondering if she'd been changed in the night, might ask, who in the world am I? In the book Hammering with Puzzles, this is probably the greatest puzzle of all for Alice. It is the question that the best novels and children's stories return again and again. If the heroine is at one level, the straight guy in this series of bizarre comic turns, at another adventure composed of miniature Bildungsroman and nonsensical form. It is as if the Harold Bloom called the internalization of the quest romance in romantic poetry, with its obsession with questions of identity, were rewritten as the utopian comedy of manners, a combination of Shelley's Alistair and Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. The queeriness and nonsense language and the bizarre rules and regulations the creatures try to impose on Alice tells us much about the terrifying arbitrariness of the world she has to operate in, but also about who is she. One of the great appeals of the Alice books is that, like Kafka's The Trial and the Castle, they dramatize the puzzle nature of identity in the world dominated by rules and rulers that remain obstinately unpredictable and indecipherable. In one of the early shape-changing scenes in Wonderland, Alice goes to the table to measure herself by it. There is scenes in which this is what is happening all through both narratives. In fact, when Alice worries about her identity, she reveals herself to be very much a child of her time and class. In this, she is like Alice Liddell, the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, born into the hearts of the English establishment, a well-educated upper middle class Oxonian girl, versed in good manners, good verse, and the rules of chess, cards, and croquet. Christ Church was the smartest Oxbridge College, where the Prince of Wales became an undergraduate in 1859, and Queen Victoria visited the Liddells in the deanery in 1860. Not long after, Through the Looking Glass, Alice was briefly involved with Prince Leopold, who'd attended her sister Lorena's wedding in 1874 and had been photographed by Dodgson. So that the royal scenario that pervades both stories reflect on her own social status, as well as on the romance conventions of fairy tales and the games of cards and chess she is caught up in. The fictional Alice measures herself by her superior knowledge and social status. I'm sure I can't be Mabel, for I know all sorts of things, and she knows such a very little. Besides, she and I'm I. And oh dear, how puzzling is it all is. Her adventures test her sense of identity to the full. Her worries have something in common with those Elizabeth Bishop dramatized in her searching autobiographical poem in the writing room about a young girl exactly Alice's age who, looking into the mirror of other people, reflecting on who she is herself. Why should I be my aunt or me or anyone else? She asked. I said to myself 3 days, and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying to it to stop the sensation of falling off the round turning world into a cold blue black space. But I felt, you are an I, you are an Elizabeth, you are one of them. I want to read that again. I said to myself, 3 days, and you'll be 7 years old. I was saying it to stop the sensation of falling off the round, turning world into a cold blue black space. But I felt, you are an I, you are an Elizabeth, you are one of them. Alice's fall down the rabbit hole induces a comparable identity crisis. The descent into a deep walls shake all the assumptions of her waking self. When she tries to reestablish her pose by recruiting the improving verses of Isaac Watts, how doth the little busy bee, the admirable industrious bee, turns into a predicatory crocodile with gentle smiling jaws. Having traversed the poised hymns, she fears she must be Mabel after all. I shall have to go and live in that poky little house and have next to no toys to play with and oh, ever so many lessons to learn. No, I've made up my mind about it. If I'm Mabel, I'll stay down here. When the white rabbit takes her for a housemaid, soon afterwards Alice exclaimed, how surprised he'll be when he finds out who I am. Whoever she is, she couldn't be one of the servant classes in a poky little house. Hers is a world of governess, schoolrooms, middle class etiquette, tea parties, croquet lawns, visiting royalties, and cureless pedants, just like Alice Liddell and Dachshund own. By and large, those she meets in her adventure are upper and middle class too, with the exception of the rabbit stage Irish gardener, Hatton and Haggai, and a few other bit part players with vaguely cockneyfied voices, and creatures generally speak what Alice calls good English. As I hope the notes to this edition show, Dachshund constructed Alice's dream worlds out of the details of Alice Liddell's actual environment, and did so with something of a meticulous literalism of contemporary paintings, such as for Maddox Brown's work, Frith's Derby Day, or domestic genre scenes of painters admired by Dachshund, such as Arthur Hughes and Melias. Tenniel thereafter proved an inspired choice of illustrator for Alice and her world. His graphic idiom, however fantastic and allegorically croquette, grotesque, is a pedantically referential and exhibition catalog of Victorian social types, settings, furnitures, and costumes, just like Dachshund's own. When Alice travels underground and through the glass, it is not only her unconscious dream world that she finds, but Victorian England and the world of the Oxford establishment she shared with Dachshund. Alice's unconsciousness parody of Watts' hymn about the busy bee invoked not Protestant industry and moral purposiveness, but the crocodile's jaws and claws. And William Empson has pointed out how high the proportion of the jokes, poems, and parodies in the Alice books hinge upon death and eating. The secure domestic order of Alice's morale unversed is exposed to reveal terror and appetite. Wonderland sounds endemic, as do many of Dachshund's accounts of childhood, but the world of the stories is grim as well as comic. So there's a lovingly garden there, but also a pool of tears. Nature in Wonderland is more akin and Tenian's nature red in tooth and claw than Wordsworth's fair seed bed. It's overshadowed by the fear of death and extinction. Think of the dodo and reverberations, and of the Darwinian debate about evolution, and that had taken place in Oxford in 1859 through 60. The Wonderland Garden is no childhood Eden, but a life and death croquet match presided over by a homicidal queen shouting off with their heads every second minute. Faced with all this random and competitiveness, Alice notes they are dreadfully fond of beheading people here. The great wanderer, is there anyone left alive? Even Alice herself, when she gets to the lovely garden, is taken to be a marauding snake, a serpent, by the outraged maternal pigeon of Wonderland, not a human child. She inspires comparable terror in the fawn of the looking glass as soon as they leave the woods of no names. We're all mad here, says the grinning Cheshire cat, the Carolinian grin, like the crocodile, reveals a disconcerting madness and violence at the heart of its other order, but both the natural order of the garden and the legal order of the trial, with its travesty of justice. In all this, Alice emerges as the book's nonsense meter. She dismisses the court's verdict as stiff and nonsense, and as much as any Jane Austen heroine, its intellectual conscious sense makes it imperative in the world, but it's a lonely business. In the tonally bleaker, more elegiac Through the Looking Glass, the winter sequel of the Maytime trip to Wonderland, Alice's sense of self hardens in the colder, more political climate she finds 6 months later behind the glass. The air grows cold in the region of mirrors. The looking glass, like Keats' magic casement, leads into the world of Victorian medievalism and the dark wood of Spencerian romance, albeit in the comically warped form. It is a world where modern railways, newspaper, and postal systems interlock with aquatic knights, lions, and unicorns. It is dominated by political battling and competing kings and queens, the battling Tweedle brothers, the lion and unicorn, the white and red knights, the political images of Gladstone and Desire really in railway carriage, in the carriage as in the shop. I have to blow my nose. Give me like a few seconds. Sorry. I'm sorry, I had to blow my nose. Even the Garden of Live Flowers offer a pricklier, cold pastoral than the Wonderland, as can be seen in the less than rosy world view of Rose Alice Chats too. You're beginning to fade, and then you can't help one's petals getting a little untidy. Alice didn't like this idea at all. So, to change the subject, she asks, "Does she ever come out here?" "I dare say you'll see her soon," said the rose. "She's one of the kind that has 9 spikes. "Where does she wear them?" Alice asked with some curiosity. "Why, all around her head, of course," the rose replied. "I was wondering you hadn't got some too. I thought it was the regular rule against the cruel pathos of seeing the 7.5-year-old Alice as a fading flower. The rose presents adulthood with a certain grim realism. She is referring to the Red Queen with her prickly chest crown, the essence of all governess, as Dachshund called her, and the Queen was representative of the queenliness Ruckins ascribed to all women, are at best a grisly duo, the one all baseness and bile, the other all slovenliness and resignation, the one mechanically over assertive like Humpty Dumpty and the Tweedles, the other ineffectually depressive like the gnat in night. In the chess world of though through the looking glass, it seemed to be the regular rule that creatures, even the two bona fide children, the Tweedles, protected themselves by a rule acrobatic style of conversational prickliness. Though they tend to be strictlers for their own rules and regulations, their style is domineering and their order profoundly irrational. Despite this, Alice, who starts out as a pawn in the game, would like to be the queen best. The queens are not like the idealized stereotypes envisaged and visaged envisaged by Ruckins in the tract on women's education of Queen's Gardens, but studies in power and powerlessness. However well-mannered Alice may be, she inspires to be a queen too, and one powerful one. And as the story draws towards a close, she aspires towards an impressive vision of feminine autonomy in the face of the bullying she faces on all sides. When the Tweedledum says she is only part of a Red King's dream and isn't real, Alice retorts, I am real, and begins to cry. Though she succumbs to tears, she is able to argue her corner. If I wasn't real, I wouldn't be able to cry, and attempts to dismiss her discerning Berkeleyan idealism of the Tweedles as nonsense. Still faced by the dark wood, the battling philosophical twine, and the monstrous crow, she keeps her composure as best she can. When she meets that arrogant egghead Humpty Dumpty, who murderously advised her to leave off at 7, she comes out with one of the great defiant lines of 19th century childhood literature. Not unlike Oliver Twist, I want some more. I never asked advice about growing. After the battle between the lion and unicorn, she says, I do hope it's my dream. I don't like belonging to another person's. Like after the shambolic battle between the two knights, which the white knight calls a glorious victory, she affirms her freedom with characteristic defiance. I don't want to be anybody's prisoner. I want to be a queen. However, shown admirable kindness and good humor towards the absent-minded Croatic knight, she eventually gets her crown, but this isn't the end of her subjection to the falsiness endemic in Caroline nonsense. She immediately finds herself peppered with regal advice by the other-looking glass queen and finds she really doesn't like being found fault with so much. Eventually, when she rises to give a speech at her coronation banquet, and the tediously formal dinner party breaks up into pandemonium, she cries out with her most powerful blast of self-assertion, I can't stand this any longer, thus freeing herself from the game, the dream, and the mirror. Though she wins her crown and the game, she seems Though she wins her crown and the game, it seems she outgrows both at the very moment when the dream of being a queen is realized and found to be a nightmarish as her time as a child and pawn. Through Dachshunds inherits the first generation of romantic poets' sense of childhood. Humpty Dumpty glory recalls Wordsworth, as does the opening poem of Looking Glass, and the second generation interest in the romance and dreams. His own dream child pursues her quest through a world which is as profoundly social as that of Jane Austen. In the framed poems of each book and in the account he gives in Alice on the stage, the author writes as if Alice travels to fairyland of pastoral childish innocence. As Issa Bowman noticed, however, Dachshund himself cared for neither flowers nor animals, and the language of Wonderland is the product of culture, not nature. In it, Alice is confronted by grave travesties of most of the institutions which govern her and her author's life, the monarchy, the rule of law, education, grammar, and social etiquette. So, after the fall and bodily metamorphosis of the opening chapters of Wonderland, Alice is caught up in first with a caucus race with wild animals, a parody of comparative natural selection and democratic procedure, then the fussy domestic life of the fastidious and bachelor rabbit, complete with maid and gardener, having discussed growth and reproduction with a caterpillar and pigeon, and madness with a brainy, disembodied cat. Alice finds herself in a more complex ritual of Wonderland society. First, the endless rotating mat tea party with its parodies of a parlor song recital children's story as told by the dormouse and the tea time etiquette. Then the shambolic royal croquet game with the queen, her courtiers, and minions, all flaunting the rules of that popular new middle class game regularly played by the Liddells on the deanery lawn and playing havoc with the garden. Then, to cap it all, the Mock Turtle and Griffon's nostalgic old boys duet about their school days. The Mock Turtle and Griffon are two highly artificial creatures feathered not by biology but language, and their mournfully planning chronicle of distant school days recollected in tranquility. Parades not only established curriculum of private education and public school of days, but the entire educational system based on reeling and wreathing. There's particularly pugnance in all allusions to classical laughing and grief, Latin and Greek, but also the classical genres of comedy and tragedy, since these are intimately associated with Alice's father, Dean Liddell, co-author of the famous Greek lexicon used in schools, how the creatures order one about and make one repeat lessons. Alice observes, I might just as well be at school at once. The Griffon and Mock Turtle are parodic products of the education system. They Romanize so tearfully, just as their performance of the lobster quadrille and the galumphing party and fashionable ballroom dancing, an institution that played a positively Darwinian role in the struggle of the 19th century girls for suitable husbands. Nonsense thieves on travestying authority, as Alice's last view of Wonderland is the observed court scene where the knave of hearts is accused of stealing tarts and tried before a court dominated by an incompetent king, tyrannical queens, and abject jury. The nonsense theater of Wonderland and the haywire kings and queens comes to a climatic final, and this finely tuned satire on their social order, if other it offers a deadpan comedy of bad manners. The social world of Through the Looking Glass is dominated by the nominal kings and queens of chess and is, if anything, more systematic, constricting than that of the earliest book. It begins in an Untiti Janus-based version of the haughty Borgia's drawing room of Alice's home. peopled and quarreling kings and queens, but soon moves into another garden, a caricature of the lush flower garden invoked by the disappointed lover of Tennyson Maud, and part of a wider landscape which is modeled not on any natural or picture K order, but on a geometrically mapped out chessboard. This may seem less archaic than Wonderland, but it's no less threatening as a mirror of modernity. It's all a great game of chess that's being played all over the world. We are told where it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place, the Red Queen says, and where people in the railway carriage think in chorus, the time is worth £1,000 a minute, land £1,000 an inch, in language £1,000 a word. In the Looking Glass and Sex episode where she stakes the train, Alice is caught up in a cipher in the communication. Networks of Victorian England, she has to produce a ticket of validate her travel, but is told she could as well be sent by luggage, telegraph, or post. Since, like a stamp, she had a head on her and gets classified in terms of ticket offices, alphabets, and in a chapter about names, her name. Throughout all this, she is confronted by two opposing male figures who in the Tenniel's drawing look suspiciously like the two so looks like the two politicians who dominated parliamentary politics at this time. So William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, the later appropriately dressed in paper and reading a newspaper. She is also subjected to aggressive public scrutiny. So all this time, the guard was looking at her, first through the telescope, then through a microscope, and then through an opera glass. At last, he said, "You are traveling the wrong way," and shut up the window and went away. Alice's progress, as befitting a pawn in the game of chess, is made through a series of bewildering, abrupt, and involuntary jumps from place to place and from time to time. Despite the projections of the modern political order of Victorian Brighton that shaped so much of the Looking Glass world and those archetypal modern settings, the train and the shop, Looking Glass is haunted by the past and disconcertingly parodic, nonsensical forms. Jabberwocky, the first poem Alice encounters, is a telegrammatic reductio of a dragon-slaying northern epic, and after her railway journey, Alice finds herself in the wood of no names, an eerie place where she loses her own name, and who am I, she wonders. And during the brief pan-like communion with the fawn, her identity as a human child, though she recovers her name, she isn't out of the wood yet. The bulk of the rest of her journey is set against the backdrop of a dark forest that a legacy of both Spenserian romance and German fairy tales. It is there that she meets a series of characters from traditional nursery rhymes, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the Lion and the Unicorn, and Humpty Dumpty and the White Knights, a sad, quixotic figure who is both the eccentric inventor like Dachshund, and a travesty of the heroic pre-Raphaelite medievalism and or of Rossetti Morris and the Loretti's idolists of the king. Tenniel's frontispiece illustration and the White Knight guy, that lumbering pictorial medievalizing of Senior is Sombras at Ford in the same vein. Through the Looking Glass has some affinity with the Gothic revivalism of Pugin's Houses of Parliament and nearer home for Dachshund, the fake antique frescoes recently designed for the Oxford Union, but reveals it in its own nonsensical anachronism, even as the book takes us through the iconography and the chivalric and royal past. Humpty Dumpty characteristically assumes Alice has read about him in the history of England, and the lion and the unicorn survive in the royal coat of arms. Its constitutional style, manner, and tone are unmistakably modern, and through the Looking Glass, Tenniel dresses Alice in the newly fashionable hairband and stripped stockings of time, and the authors always presented her as a thoroughly contemporary girl. Through this story, veers back and forth between the past and present, and dizzily as Twain's Connecticut Yankee, Alice's final coronation banquet is clearly represented in the text and illustration as a Victorian dinner party, complete with decanters and soup tureens. The text ends with the Dunciad and apocalypse of the hierarchical social world, and the story dissolves in Alice's final impotent gesture of revolt. "I can't stand this any longer," she cried, as she jumped up and seized the tablecloth with both hands. One good pull, and plate, dishes, guests, and candles, and crashing down together in a heap on the floor. Alice's protest is against the irrational nonsense of the mad chess game she has dreamed she is part of, with its comic but potentially threatening dream logic. To reestablish her own identity and her faith in the real world of social conduct, she has to reject the awful travesty of proper social life played out by the queens, kings, and subjects of the Looking Glass world. Despite his subsequent canonization by the surrealist Dachshund and the Euclidean logician and poet Christian and the political conservative whose life was frantically devoted to tidiness and order. Alice mirrors him in this. Nevertheless, it is possible to read her dream adventures as a protest against the world of governess, teachers, bullies, and pedagogists, and all social rituals they impose on her. The Hall of Mirrors discovered in the Looking Glass inevitably reflects back on the world of the Victorian drawing rooms, schoolrooms, and playrooms, and the ordinary assumptions of a comfortable middle class childhood this side of the mirror. Who dreamed it? Asks the last chapter. The book's dream realism is clearly a reflection of the fictional Alice's waking world. It can also be as a reflection of the real Alice Liddell domestic universe. As I suggested earlier, beyond that, however, we can read the two books as reflects of their author, Charles Dodson, also of the Christ Church. He appears to have so closely identified with his dream heroine that his problems of identity, of establishing coherent selfhood in the face of a violent charges inherent in human life and in disorder at the heart of the order, seem mirrored in hers. Looking Glass is much preoccupied by passing time, violence, aging, and death, as well as potential and linguistic aberration and disorder discovered in Wonderland. The obsessively tidy Dachshund was acutely concerned by contemporary debates which threatened the established order. The dreams of Alice, the Oxford child, and her author about on the universe of the mid 19th century Oxford, a place that considered itself with good reason to be at the century of the British intellectual life at the time. In an Oxford Chiel, published in 1874, only 4 years after Through the Looking Glass, Dodson published a series of highly political, satirical squibs on university issues written over the previous 9 years about the new Belfry Commission by Liddell for Christ Church, the of the defeat of Gladstone as MP for Oxford, the salary and status of Liberal Jowett, who was professor of Greek and a notorious historical contributor of the Essay and Reviews of 1861, the terms of Max Muller Professorship, Comparative Philological, among other burning issues of the time, though Dodson disclaimed making any such topical or political allusions in the Alice book, controversies is very air breath by the embattled creatures in both Humpty Dumpty is the most belligerently radical of the many philosophers of language who haunt their pages, but the majority of the creatures Alice meets are comparatively argumentative and constitutionally prone to waggle and to the interpretation of words, names, rules, and logic. We should remember that in between the two Alice books in 1869, Dodson published one of his own most sustained exercises in academic controversy, Euclid and His Modern Rivals, a work intended to champion and popularize Euclidean geometry for a modern audience. It's a dramatic dialogue featuring the ghost of Euclid, in which a modern mathematics lecturer, anonymously called the Minnows, and his great antagonist, Professor Nimad, a German for nobody, sit in judgment over 13 rival theorists who called the secure order of Euclidean geometry, which Dodson wished to defend. So, in the disputations world of Wonderland, it is possible to hear echoes of such controversies as well as more stirring controversies aroused by the Oxford moments. The Darwin debate of the 1860s reconciles aesthetic Max Muller's brand of comparative philology and Arnold's culture of anarchy, 1869, and one of the Popian satires of time. Dodson ironically takes a liberal side, warning readers to shun conservatism, evil star, and affirm the march of mind against Oxford wisely slow traditional order in which intellectual values are tempted by moral and Christian tones. Neglect the heart and cultivate the brain. Then this shall be the burden of our song. All change is good. Whatever is wrong. The intellect proud flag shall be unfurled, and brain alone shall rule the world. Possible ripples of aftershock of these ideological contests may be detected playing over and under the exclusively nonsensical surface of the two children's book, the conservative Dachshund wrote for the daughter of the dean of Christ Church, Christine, the restless reformer Liddell. But if there are echoes of such contemporary debates, they are muted and indirected. The main focus of the two books of Alice's own conscience as she struggles to make sense of the world through the looking glass is more unstable, changeable, and radically nonsensical than her author could acknowledge elsewhere. The innocent language of nonsense associated with Alice, the child of his dream, gives expression to more things than are dreamed of in Dachshund, consciously, philosophy, or his culture dream of order. So I am finished with my reading for today. I had only 22 pages to read, so I just finished that, and I'm probably going to pick up and complete another 40 pages later on today. So look out for me later if you want to hear more. I'll be picking up where it says 5 decoding nonsense, decoding the child. So we're going to talk about decoding nonsense and decoding the child. And again, this is the book Alice's Adventure in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Thank you for watching. Bye.